Hi again, everyone. It's Michael Voloshinovich here from Vibrant Shot. Today we're going to be diving into the exciting world of color adjustments in Photoshop. So the main reason I wanted to make this video is that I think a lot of people aren't aware of the sort of myriad of ways that Photoshop allows you to adjust the color within your images. And oftentimes I see a lot of people just relying on the sort of pre-built action packs that are out there and just kind of using the same color sets over and over again. So today we're going to cover some of the main ways. Like I said, there's tons of different ways of doing it, but we're going to cover probably 6 or so different ways that I typically use to make adjustments within portrait images, architecture images. It works for pretty much anything. So we're going to get started off with using some of these adjustment layers that we have over here, and we're actually going to start with the one I think that confuses people the most, which is the curves adjustment. So with the curves adjustment, most people tend to just use curves to adjust midtones, highlights, shadows, but rather than operating on the RGB side of things here, we're going to actually go in and select the individual color channel that we want to operate on. So essentially we've got our RGB channels over here, and if we just go into blue, I think the important thing to understand here is actually what's going on when we start modifying this curve within a specific color channel. So basically what ends up happening is if we start manipulating this corner over here, we're going to be adjusting obviously our highlights, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be shuffling between two different colors, which is going to be blue and yellow, because blue and yellow are opposites. So if we start dragging over here, we see that we're now adding a little bit more blue into our highlights, and if we drag down, we're going to start adding more yellows within our highlights. And similarly on the shadow side of things, we can do the same thing. If we start dragging upwards, we see that we're starting to introduce some more blue, sort of a blue color cast into our shadows, and if we drag across, we're going to start getting more yellow in our shadows. So, a very typical adjustment that you'll see a lot in fashion images is where you sort of bring up the amount of blue within our shadows, and then we bring down the highlight adjuster here, so we give a little bit more yellow within the skin tones. In this case, our skin tones are highlights, and ultimately very quick adjustment, and it creates a pretty nice pleasing effect within our image. So the same thing actually works within every one of the channels. It's the same concept. Within red, we're modifying red and cyan. Within green, we're modifying green and magenta, and as I just said, blue is blue and yellow adjustment. So that's one that I often use, and obviously you can start experimenting with this, playing around with the midtones and just modifying the curve to your heart's content, and finding something that works nicely for you. Now we'll move on to the next adjustment, which is going to be our levels adjustment. And effectively, levels and curves are pretty much doing the same thing, except with a slightly different interface. So once again, we're going to get out of our RGB adjustment channel here. We're just going to go right into the individual one. So I'm just going to pick blue again, so that we can compare directly to how things look when we actually operate on curves. So if we see here that we no longer can go sort of up and down like we could with the levels. We're really kind of reduced to sliding one way within the shadows, one way within the highlights, and that's really all we have. So if we start adjusting the highlights here, we see that we're introducing more blue into the highlights, and if we start adjusting towards the right hand side on the shadows, we're introducing more orange, or I should say yellow, into our shadows here. So if we want to go in the opposite direction, that is where the output level slider actually comes into play. And here, if we start dragging this towards the left, we see the highlights start to go towards yellow again, just like we did with our curves adjustment. Same story goes for the shadow side of things. If we start bringing that towards the right, we're now introducing again more blues into our shadows. So the end result of that is pretty much the same, except we're using a slightly different interface, and of course we can modify on the mid-tone level as well. If we go this way, we start to introduce again a little bit more blue within the mid-tones, and if we go towards the right, we start introducing a little bit more yellow within the mid-tones. So like I said, pretty much the exact same effect. The only difference is the interface is different, and ultimately your choice of one or the other depends on what you're more comfortable using. So we're going to switch off that levels, and we're going to go into our next adjustment, which we're going to cover off the hue saturation briefly. And the reason I'm not going to cover it in detail is because it's typically not one that I use very often for making changes to a color. Particularly if we go in the master level here and we start changing hues, the image can very quickly start to just go crazy and look terrible. So we don't want that. If we go into the individual color channels, on the other hand, let's say we go into red and we start modifying things, once again, it can be a little bit difficult to achieve the effect that we're looking for. Actually, I'm just going to select blue so that we're working consistently with the blue color here. And as we can see, if we start playing with these different hue values, it's hard to achieve that effect that we were looking for before, where we were sort of adjusting shadows and highlights. So where I will typically use hue saturation is more just on the saturation and lightness sliders. So if I find, for example, that maybe the model's skin tone has a little bit too much red in it, I might go in here and either adjust down the saturation level to take a little bit of that redness out. As we can see, the skin starts to go a little bit more pale now. Or we can increase our lightness level, which ultimately will achieve kind of the same effect by once again kind of lightening the skin, and of course afterwards we can mask out the lips if we don't want that to affect the color of the lips. So that's really the only place where I use hue saturation as far as color adjustment goes. Now I will use it a little bit later in the demonstration to show you another cool technique that you can use with it, but as far as sort of globally adjusting an image, usually just the saturation and lightness sliders are all that I will use. So the next thing that we're going to look at is going to be the gradient map, which is one that most people don't find terribly useful, and they kind of think of it as being a little bit of a silly tool, but it actually can become quite useful, and then you actually get pretty nice results with it if you know how to use it. So basically, let's start off here. We're going to get rid of this default filter that we have over here. We're going to just pick this one here as a sort of starting point, and we're going to go into our color over here. We're going to select maybe a blue tone, so we're just going to kind of drag down into this general space here. So now we see that the image is quite stylized looking, and that's probably not what we're going for unless we're going for something really funky. So the next thing we need to do is kind of make this look a little bit more realistic, and to do that we can start playing with the different blend modes that we have here. So first one we're going to select is the color blend mode, and as we can see, that again changes things, and they're not looking terribly great. But what we can do is we can start dragging the opacity slider down to sort of a reasonable level, maybe around 18%, 15 to 18%. And at this point here, we see that the results are actually starting to look a little bit more realistic and actually not too bad. So once again, with a really simple adjustment here, and we've modified the color of our image quite a bit. And in this case, it may feel a little bit minor, but again, we've introduced a little bit of that blue color into our shadows and a little bit of the yellow / orange color into our highlights, and that's basically exactly what the gradient map does. Anything on the left hand side ends up being mapped into your shadows. Anything on the right hand side ends up going into your highlights, and of course anything in the middle maps more along the midtones. So again, you can play with some of these different blend modes, and two other ones that work pretty well are soft light, which will give you a more realistic effect. In this case, very subtle, so you can actually drag the opacity on soft light up to even 21%, and again, that creates an image that looks fairly realistic and fairly nice. And you can also use hard light, which will be a lot more intense, but we can just again bring that opacity down, and once again we're left with something that's fairly realistic. So now, next thing we're going to look at is a feature that I do use quite often, and that's the Selective Color Adjustment. So here, basically what the Selective Color allows you to do is to go into the individual RGB and CMYK channels and adjust sort of the balance of colors within those. So if we go, for example, into our blue, once again, let's say we start dragging down our yellow slider, that will once again take our blues and add more yellow into them. So we had a little bit more. We have a little bit of blue in the hair, and we see that will start to increase the blue. And basically, what we're doing is we're taking away the yellow. So as before, blue and yellow are opposite. So if we start increasing yellow, obviously we're adding more yellow, and if we decrease yellow, we're going to be adding more blue. Now, if we want to achieve an effect that was similar to what we had within our curves adjustment, we can start going into these whites, neutrals, and blacks. And you can sort of think of blacks as the shadows, whites as the highlights. And so if we go into blacks over here and we start dragging yellow down, so again introducing more blue, we see that once again we're pumping up the blacks and the shadows here to have a more bluish type of cast. Now all these sliders again operate on sort of the same manner. Cyan will increase red if we go on the negative side, and of course increase cyan if we go on the positive side. Magenta will be green if we go towards the negative, and of course add magenta on the positive. Now another nice slider over here is actually the black slider, and that allows you to achieve a similar effect to what we saw within hue saturation, where we, for example, wanted to lighten the redness within a skin tone. So if we select our reds here and we find that the model has a little too much red within her skin tone, we can go in here and actually dial down the amount of black, which basically just takes some of the redness out. As you can see, the effect is kind of similar to what we had within within the lightness and saturation sliders in the hue saturation adjustment. Similarly here, we can of course tweak, maybe again predominantly skin tones are predominantly red, so if we want to adjust the skin tones, we can go into our red color over here and start modifying the amount of yellow within that. We can start adding more red if we want, so we can do that just by taking cyan down, and that will introduce more red. Similarly, we can increase blacks, which will give us more red within our red. So it's it's a really interesting tool to use when you're trying to kind of go into the individual colors and make adjustments on a very specific level. So it's not a tool that I use typically to adjust highlights, midtones, and shadows. For that, I'll usually use curves or levels. But if there's a particular color that's bothering me within the image, selective color is what I'll use to modify that color individually. So now the final adjustment that we'll do is actually not an adjustment layer. It's essentially, we're just going to create a brand new layer, and what we're going to do is we're going to apply sort of a color cast within our image. So we've got this this sort of cyan color selected as our starting point. So we're going to use that. We're going to click Option Delete or Alt Delete if you're on a PC, and it's going to fill our layer with the foreground color. We're then going to go down and select our color blend mode, and now as we can see, the image looks just completely blue and not terribly good. But the next thing we're going to do is we're going to focus our adjustment to just the highlights. So maybe we want to just take the highlights and apply this little cyan cast to them. So we're going to add a layer mask to our image, and then we're going to use a tool that or a technique I should say, that I picked up from Aaron Nace over at Flurn, which is just a great little tool to allow you to sort of concentrate in a particular layer into shadows or highlights, and that's the apply image. So you go to image, apply image, that brings up this box over here, and if we select invert, for example, we see that our layer mask is effectively an inverted image of our current image, whereby everything that is a shadow goes through the layer mask, so that's all in white, and anything that is a highlight does not go through. So that's not what we want. We actually want to block the shadows from coming through and make sure that the highlights go through. So that's what we have right here. We've got all of our shadows, which is predominantly the hair being masked out within our mask, and then the skin and the highlights are going through the mask. So now if we just click OK there, we see that our cyan cast is applied predominantly within our highlights. So now what we can do is we can start refining these. If we're not, for example, happy with these colors, first off we're going to probably lower the opacity a little bit, because that is just too intense. And then let's say we're not happy with this starting color here. Maybe we don't like the cyan. So that's where we can actually bring up our hue saturation adjustment and start making some changes. So we're going to hit Command U. That's going to bring up our hue saturation box. Now just make sure you do have the actual color layer selected, not the layer mask. And from here we can actually start modifying the overall color of that particular color cast. So now if we start to move towards this end of things, we see that we're once again introducing a little bit of a more golden yellow kind of cast, just like we had within our curves adjustment. So if we're happy with that, next thing we can do is, let's say we want to restrict this adjustment to just the brightest of the highlights. So that's where we can actually go into our mask now. We're going to hit Command L or Control L if you're on a PC, and that's going to allow us to actually refine this mask a little bit more. So if we start to drag our midtones over to the right hand side, we see that we are completely narrowing down this mask to just the brightest highlights. So we can drag that essentially all the way over, and really just the most faint highlights will be shining through. And if we want something in the middle, maybe we'll sort of end up right here. So now we've restricted that color cast to a fairly small area, which is essentially this portion of our model's face. So if we start to toggle that on and off, we see that essentially we've just added a little bit of warmth within the highlights, and in that case it happens to be our skin tones. So that's, those are some of the main ways that I tend to adjust colors within my image. So we looked at about 6 different ways, and what I'll typically do is, as I kind of work through these, if I find something that I like, I will set up a new action. I'll record my settings within that particular adjustment, and then I'll just kind of work through some of those saved actions every time I'm approaching a new image, just to see what looks good. And oftentimes I'll just take the action as given, and sometimes I'll just use that as sort of a reference point, and apply it and then tweak the colors from there on. So quite a bit of information covered there, and I hope you found that useful, and we'll see you next time.